Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, join me each episode as we discuss all things guitar. Well, hey there everybody, and welcome into yet another exciting episode of Shad's Guitar Show. And as I always say and truly mean, I am so glad that you're here and joining me for this episode. And this one is going to be about a guitar player that I know very well. I have studied for a long time, but maybe not in the traditional sense. And the guitarist we're going to talk about today is definitely not a household name as far as guitar players go, except for those of us who are church players. Now, some of you who aren't into the church thing may be ready to switch this one off and say, nah, I'll listen to the next one. But don't do that, because it's kind of fascinating, interesting, and the player that we're going to talk about is really great. And whether you're a church player or interested in, worship music at all, he's a great player, and we can all learn something from him. So the story's pretty interesting, and I think, stick with me and see if you don't find something cool in this episode. So today we're talking about Nigel Hendroff, the sonic architect behind some of the most iconic modern worship guitar tones. If you've ever heard those ambient swells, shimmering delays, and atmospheric textures coming out of churches or worship recordings over the last, say, 15 to 20 years, chances are Nigel had something to do with it. Nigel Hendroff is an Australian guitarist best known for his long-standing role with Hillsong and the broader Hillsong Church music movement. Now, Hillsong isn't just a church band, it's a global music force. Their recordings and live albums have reached literally millions of people, and their sound has shaped an entire genre of modern worship music. Now, Nigel became a key part of that sound in the mid-2000s. While many guitarists in worship settings were still leaning on pretty straightforward tones, Nigel helped push things into a more cinematic, ambient direction. Instead of just playing chords, he was painting landscapes. If you listen to albums like Aftermath, Zion, or Empires, you'll hear Nigel's fingerprints all over them. His playing style is less about flashy solos and more about texture, space, and emotion. He's a master of volume swells, delay-driven rhythms, reverb-heavy pads, layered guitar parts that build atmosphere. In many ways, Nigel helped define what we now think of as the modern worship guitar sound. And that sound has spilled over and way beyond just church music into indie, ambient, and even film score-inspired guitar playing. Now, as an aside, that style of cinematic ambient playing was around way before Nigel Hendroff and, the modern worship sound. I don't mean to imply that, guys weren't doing it before. You have Daniel Lanois, Brian Eno, a lot of players who were doing really ambient cinematic guitar playing, well before this movement. But I think this really brought it to the forefront and kind of modernized it and made it more accessible in a lot of ways. And it was really building on what we were already hearing from, a more accessible player like The Edge from U2. Nigel's style is all about restraint and intention. He's not trying to fill every space. In fact, he often does the opposite. And key elements of his playing would be minimalism, playing fewer notes but really making them count. Texture over technique. It's about sound design as much as accomplished guitar playing. Dynamics, swells, crescendos, and emotional builds. Rhythmic delays, using delay as part of the groove. And that falls well into that, U2 The Edge category that we just talked about. He treats the guitar almost like a keyboard or synth, creating pads and layers instead of just traditional riffs. But I also want to point out that Nigel is definitely no slouch as a player. I think there's this misconception that, a lot of church players just rely heavily on effects pedals. That's why they have these big giant pedal boards. And, it's just this atmospheric delays and reverbs and everything to kind of mask, the inability to play well. And Nigel, although he employs a lot of textural and, atmospheric playing as we have discussed thus far, definitely is a great player. And, he could sit down, plug straight into an amp and play really well. So he isn't reliant on the effects. He has used the effects to create, a style of playing, but it's not to cover up for his inability to play because, again, Nigel is really, really a great player. So talking a little bit about Nigel's gear, well, he is a gear architect just as much as he is a guitarist. For guitars, Nigel has, often used Strat or Telecaster style guitars over the years, either from Fender or, a myriad of boutique builders. And he also has used Gretsch guitars quite frequently. He even has a Nigel Hindroff signature Gretsch guitar. And a variety of other guitars over the years, but always, he's using the guitars, I think, in the same way that like the Edge from U2 uses them, with creating a really specific sound in mind. Like, what does that guitar offer in terms of tone, and how do I use it, in conjunction with effects and building a sound around that guitar. For amplifiers, he has leaned heavily into the Vox AC30 thing. Again, another nod to the Edge. It's a huge part of the Hillsong sound, which is particularly known for that chime and sparkle. And they just tend to work really beautifully with delays and reverbs. He'll also employ a lot of Fender-style clean amps, and a lot of times running them in stereo or, kind of using them together to get the best of both worlds from those amplifier styles. So the effects is where Nigel really shines. His pedal board is legendary in worship and ambient guitar circles. And it has, like for most of us that are into pedal boards, it has evolved and changed as new things come out. He's done some signature pedals, but really, you could say that the backbone of his sound has been, at least, as I think about it, in the very early days, he was using the Boss DD20 or the Line 6 DL4, or, as time has moved on, the Strymon Timeline. And he uses the delay, in very unique way for very rhythmic patterns, dotted eighth note delays, again, a nod to the Edge, and layered repeats. For reverb, I think primarily nowadays he's using the Strymon Big Sky, but he's using, again, this reverb to create these massive atmospheric spaces. And, I would say that the Strymon Big Sky in particular is a staple in modern worship rigs. Or, if you're using a modeler or you're using a profiler, you're definitely using those big ambient atmospheric reverbs. For modulation textures, chorus, tremolo, ambient modulation effects, and these just add movement and depth to his tone. The volume pedal, of course, is a critical part of the setup, used for those violin-like swells, and it's really essential for ambient style playing. For overdrives, he's used a variety of things. You never really think of Nigel as using really crushing or heavy tones. Typically, he's going to lean into the kind of open sounding, light overdrives that are, for lack of better words, and we all joke about the word transparent, just to add some, light edge of breakup. And, he'll get into the medium gain thing, and once in a while a little bit heavier, but that's kind of rare. Nigel's setup, it's not just about individual pedals, it's about how they interact. But the magic comes from how he stacks his delays and reverbs to create these really huge, immersive landscapes. So obviously, Nigel Hindroff has had a massive impact on modern worship guitar players, ambient and cinematic guitar styles, and church music production worldwide. You could argue that he helped create an entirely new language for guitar in worship music. And today, thousands of players are chasing the tones that they trace directly back to Nigel's approach. And I think he was truly probably the first, or one of the very first, worship guitar heroes. Now, again, there were lots of guys playing worship for literally thousands of years making worship music before this. But as far as guitar goes, there was a lot of great guitarists, but in terms of being in a band that was really world famous, I think Nigel was arguably the first kind of worship guitar hero, and he would go on to influence a lot of other guys, and some that we'll definitely talk about. One of my favorites is a player named James Duke, who really embodies a lot of what I like about guitar tones. So we'll probably talk about James. There's plenty of other guitarists as time has gone on. We've seen the rise of, for those of us who are church players, probably more than Hillsong now, we're learning songs by Elevation Worship, Jesus Culture. There's so many others that have, come on the scene in the last probably, 20 years. But really, Nigel and Hillsong sort of started the whole thing. What makes Nigel unique is that he redefined what a guitarist's role could be. Instead of lead player and rhythm player, he became something else entirely. A sound designer, a textural musician, a sonic architect. And that mindset has influenced not just worship music, but how guitar fits into modern music as a whole. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with worship music and want to hear what this is all about, check out some songs by Hillsong, From the Inside Out, Hosanna, or I Surrender, for some really, really great examples of Nigel's playing. I think you'll find something enjoyable there for sure. And you know what? The lyrics are great too, and there's a great message, so something else to check out. And as always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure to share it with a guitar playing friend and leave me a rating wherever you're listening. It is incredibly helpful to the show, and I do appreciate that. Also, head over to YouTube and follow Shad's Guitar Show. Subscribe, please. And also follow me on Instagram, Shad's Guitar Show. Let's connect on all those platforms. And I love it when you guys engage, so leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, and if you're a church guitar player, what's your favorite Nigel Hindroff riff? And if you're not a church player, but you're just into ambient style music, who are some other guitar players that we should all be checking out in this style? And I look forward to talking to you guys again next time. And never forget, the best guitar player is the one who is having the most fun.